There is a sound that an entire generation of American men can hear in their sleep. It is not a melody. It is not a voice. It is a mechanical snap, the sharp metallic click-clack of a lever being cocked, the ratcheting engagement of a spring compressing inside a steel tube, and then the release. Thwack, the sound of a copper ball bearing tearing through the air at 300 feet per second. If you are over 60 years old and you grew up anywhere in this country between the 1940s and the 1980s, you know exactly what that sound is. You can feel it in your hands right now. The weight of the wood stock against your shoulder, the cold metal of the trigger under your finger, the smell of gun oil, and the faint metallic taste of fear when you realized you had just dented your father's car with a BB you swore would hit the tin can. This was not a toy. It was a teacher. It taught you that actions have consequences, that gravity is real, that if you aim badly, you miss. And if you aim very badly, you break something expensive and your father finds out. For nearly a century, one company built these teachers. They built them in a factory that stretched longer than 2 football fields. They built them from steel and wood. They built them heavy. They built them to last 100 years. And they built them with the unshakable belief that an American boy needed to learn how to handle power. The company was called Daisy. And at its peak, it was not just a business. It was a rite of passage. Owning a Daisy Red Ryder was the moment a boy stepped across the threshold from childhood into something harder, something real. But that empire is gone now. The factory where it was born has been demolished. The wood has been replaced with plastic. The steel has been replaced with lawyers. And the sound, that distinctive thwack of a BB hitting a tin can, has been replaced by the silent glow of a video game screen. How does an empire built on iron and discipline vanish into plastic and safety warnings? Did it lose to competition, or did it lose something far more dangerous? Chapter 1. The Windmill Men. The year was 1888, and the mood inside the boardroom of the Plymouth Iron Windmill Company was as cold as the Michigan winter rattling the window panes. Situated in the small industrial town of Plymouth, just west of Detroit, the factory was a monument to a dying dream. The air inside smelled of stale cigar smoke, coal dust, and anxiety. The men sitting around the heavy oak table were not toy makers. They were serious, grim-faced industrialists who had bet their fortunes on the American farmer. They manufactured massive towering structures of iron and steel designed to pump water from the earth. But the ledger lying open on the table told a different story. It was bleeding red ink. The problem was simple physics. The windmills they built were masterpieces of engineering, indestructible, efficient, and built to last 100 years. But they were also incredibly heavy. They were made of cast iron. Transporting these behemoths from the foundry in Plymouth to the farms of the Great Plains was a logistical nightmare. The shipping costs were eating the profit margins alive. The company was on the brink of insolvency. The 25 stockholders who had pooled their money to build the factory were facing the very real possibility of losing everything. They were looking for a miracle, but all they had were warehouses full of unsellable iron. Into this atmosphere of doom walked a man named Clarence Hamilton. Hamilton was a watchmaker by trade and an inventor by spirit, a man who tinkered with gears and springs in his spare time. He was not there to talk about water pumps. He was carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He placed it on the table, unwrapped the covering, and revealed a strange skeletal contraption made of metal tubing and a crude wooden stock. It was an air rifle, but it was unlike anything the men in the room had seen before. At the time, air guns were essentially toys for the very wealthy or parlor curiosities for adults. They were complex, expensive, and fragile. Hamilton's invention was different. It was entirely metal, save for the stock. It was simple, it was rugged, and most importantly, it was cheap to manufacture. Hamilton picked up the device. He didn't ask for permission. He simply walked to the corner of the boardroom where a wire wastebasket sat filled with crumpled paper. He cocked the lever, aiming the barrel at the trash. The room fell silent. He pulled the trigger. Thwack! A lead ball propelled by a burst of compressed air tore into the wastebasket. It didn't just hit it, it punctured the paper and rattled against the wire mesh with a surprising lethal authority. The sound was sharp, distinct, and final. It was the sound of power. The general manager of the company, a man named Louis Cass, sat up in his chair. He was a practical man, a man who understood machinery. He walked over to the gun, picked it up, and felt the weight of it. It balanced perfectly in his hand. He cocked it himself, feeling the resistance of the spring, the mechanical tension building up inside the chamber. He fired it again. Thwack! He turned to Hamilton, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and admiration, and yelled a phrase that would echo through American history for the next century. "Boy, that's a daisy." In the slang of the late 19th century, a daisy was the superlative. It meant the best, the top of the line, the finest thing available. It was a compliment of the highest order. But in that moment, Louis Cass wasn't just complimenting an invention. He was naming an empire. Chapter 2. The Bribe. However, the board of directors did not immediately pivot. They were windmill men after all. They didn't understand the toy business. They viewed the gun as a novelty, a curiosity. But they were desperate. They needed a way to move the inventory of windmills that were rusting in the yard. So they hatched a plan that seems almost comical in retrospect. They decided to use the gun as a bribe. The offer was simple. If a farmer bought a Plymouth iron windmill, the company would give him a Daisy air rifle for free. It was a premium, a sweetener to close the deal. The idea was that the farmer would buy the windmill for his crops and he would take the gun home to his son or use it himself to scare off crows and rats. The strategy went into effect immediately. The sales force fanned out across the rural counties, pitching the iron towers. But when they returned to Plymouth, they brought back strange reports. The farmers were indeed interested, but they weren't asking about the water pumping capacity of the windmills. They weren't asking about the warranty on the iron blades. They were asking how much for the gun. The reports were consistent. Farmers were willing to walk away from the windmill deal if they couldn't get the rifle, but many of them were asking if they could just buy the rifle separately. The sweetener was more valuable than the meal. The heavy, expensive logistical nightmare of a windmill was being outshined by a few pounds of steel tubing and a spring. By 1895, the writing was on the wall. The Plymouth Iron Windmill Company had accidentally stumbled upon a deep primal desire in the American psyche. They had tapped into the urge for marksmanship, for targeting, for the feeling of projecting power at a distance. The board of directors made the difficult, fateful decision. They stopped casting the giant iron blades. They stopped assembling the towers. They retooled the entire factory. The blast furnaces that had once melted iron for agricultural equipment now melted lead for ammunition. In January of 1895, the board voted to officially change the name of the corporation. The word windmill was dropped forever. They became the Daisy Manufacturing Company. This transition marks a profound moment in industrial history. Usually, companies evolve slowly. They iterate. This was a mutation. A heavy industry firm dealing in the most utilitarian equipment possible transformed overnight into a purveyor of childhood fantasy. But there was a catch. Because they came from the world of iron and heavy machinery, they didn't build the guns like toys. They built them like tools. The early Daisy rifles were not fragile playthings. They were stamped from heavy-gauge steel. They used real wood for the stocks. They were assembled by machinists who were used to building things that sat in a cornfield for 50 years and survived tornadoes. When you held a Daisy in 1895, you were holding a piece of industrial equipment that had been downsized for a boy's hands. It smelled of machine oil. It had sharp edges. It had a trigger pull that required genuine effort. This accidental origin story set the tone for the next 80 years. Daisy was not a company that tried to make things safe or soft. They were a company born in a foundry. They believed that the world was made of metal and that mastering metal was the duty of every American male. They didn't know it yet, but they had just handed a loaded weapon to the youth of the nation, and the youth of the nation had responded with a resounding yes. The windmill was dead, left to rust in the scrap heap of history. But the daisy was just beginning to bloom, and its roots would dig deep into the soil of a country that was about to enter a century of change. The silence of the failing boardroom had been broken by the snap of a spring, and the echo would be heard in every backyard from Maine to California. Chapter 3. The Cathedral of Ballistics. By the 1930s, the transformation was complete. The iron windmills were a distant memory erased from the collective consciousness of Plymouth, Michigan. The factory that stood on Union Street had become something else entirely. It was no longer a place of agriculture. It was a cathedral of ballistics. It just happened to be an arsenal for children. To walk into the Daisy manufacturing plant during the Great Depression was to walk into a thunderous, chaotic symphony of American industry. The floor shook with the rhythmic pounding of massive drop forges. The air was thick with a blue haze of welding smoke and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. The man presiding over this empire of stamped steel was Cass Ho. He was the grandson of Lewis Cass Ho, the man who had named the Daisy, but he was cut from a different cloth. The grandfather had been a Victorian industrialist. The grandson was a man of the 20th century, an adventurer and a fighter. Cass Hof was an aviator who flew his own planes. He was a man who believed in risk. He looked at the youth of America and didn't see innocent cherubs who needed to be coddled. He saw future leaders. And he believed with a religious conviction that you could not build a man out of soft clay. You had to forge him. Huff operated under a philosophy that would terrify a modern parent. He believed that a boy without a gun was a boy without a compass. In his worldview, a rifle was not a weapon of destruction. It was a tool of discipline. It taught focus, it taught patience, and crucially, it taught consequences. If you missed the target, you failed. If you handled the gun carelessly and shot your thumb, it hurt. That pain was not an accident. It was the tuition fee for the school of reality. But the company needed a symbol. They had the philosophy, they had the factory, but they needed a myth. In 1938, they found it in the pages of the funny papers. Chapter 4. The Red Rider. There was a comic strip gaining popularity at the time called Red Rider. It was drawn by an artist named Fred Harmon, a man who had grown up on a ranch in Colorado and knew the West not from movies, but from the saddle. The character of Red Rider was a stoic, rough-hewn cowboy who fought for justice with a rifle in his hand. He was the antithesis of the singing cowboys of Hollywood. He was gritty, he was tough, and he was competent. Daisy approached Harmon with an idea. They wanted to build a rifle that was the physical embodiment of that comic strip. They didn't want to just put a picture of Red Rider on the box. They wanted the gun itself to feel like something that had just been pulled out of a scabbard in a dusty canyon. The result was the Daisy Red Rider model 1938. It is without hyperbole the most important artifact in the history of American play. When a boy in 1940 unboxed a Red Rider, he was not holding a fragile piece of plastic. He was holding a weapon that weighed nearly 3 pounds. The barrel and the receiver were made from heavy gauge-blued steel. The stock was not a composite. It was a solid slab of American hardwood stained a deep, rich walnut. Burned into the wood was the image of the cowboy on his horse, a branding iron mark of authenticity. But the defining feature was the lever. It was a cast metal loop that sat under the trigger guard. To cock the gun, the boy had to jam the stock against his hip, grab the lever, and crank it forward. It required muscle. It made a distinctive ratcheting click-clack sound, a mechanical engagement of the spring that signaled the weapon was live. It was a tactile experience that bridged the gap between imagination and reality. Huff and his engineers added touches of genius to the design. They added a saddle ring on the side of the receiver, a completely functional metal ring with a leather thong tied to it. It served no ballistic purpose, but it allowed a boy to tie the gun to his bike handlebars or hang it from a nail in the barn. It whispered to the child that this was a tool for the range, for the frontier. The ammunition was equally serious. The Red Rider fired a specific projectile, a .177 caliber steel ball coated in copper. They came in paper tubes or cardboard cartons. They were heavy. When you poured a handful of BBS into the loading door on the barrel, they made a sound like rain on a tin roof. They were cold to the touch. They were not orange foam darts. They were metal spheres that traveled at 300 feet per second. The sheer ubiquity of the Red Ryder in the 1940s and 50s is hard to overstate. It was the Holy Grail. It was the object around which the entire solar system of boyhood orbited. If you had one, you were a king. If you didn't, you were a peasant. It was the admission ticket to the neighborhood hierarchy. The factory in Plymouth churned them out by the millions. The noise of the presses never stopped. The town of Plymouth existed to feed the appetite of the gun. Generation after generation of workers spent their lives standing at the assembly lines, fitting the wood to the steel, testing the springs, packaging the dreams. They took immense pride in the product. They knew that if a Red Ryder fell off a bicycle or was dropped in a creek, it would still work. They were building heirlooms. There was a specific sensory memory etched into the brain of every mid-century American male. It was the smell of the gun oil that coated the new steel to prevent rust. It was the stiffness of the lever on the first pull. It was the slight recoil against the shoulder, a tiny physical kick that confirmed the release of energy. And it was the sight of the copper BB flying through the air, a golden streak visible for just a fraction of a second before it struck the target with a satisfying ping. This was the golden age of the Plymouth factory. It was a time when the gap between the adult world and the child's world was narrow. The tools were the same, just sized differently. The danger was real, but it was managed. Cass Hofe sat in his office listening to the hum of the machinery, believing that he had built an eternal institution. He believed that as long as there were boys, there would be a need for steel and wood and the discipline they taught. He didn't see the plastic storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He didn't see the lawyers sharpening their pencils. He thought he was building character, but he was building a liability that a changing world would soon refuse to tolerate. Chapter 5. The Betrayal. The wind that blew through the streets of Plymouth, Michigan in the late 1950s carried a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold, creeping realization that the industrial heart of the town was stopping. For 70 years, the factory on Union Street had been the metronome of the community. The rhythmic thumping of the stamping presses, the smell of hot oil, and the shift whistle were the constants of life. But inside the executive offices, the mood had shifted from the confident swagger of the Red Ryder era to a nervous, calculating pragmatism. The enemy was no longer a rival toy company. It was not a lack of demand. The enemy was the changing face of America itself. By the time the 1960s loomed on the horizon, the cultural landscape was beginning to fracture. The era of the free-range child who could roam the woods with a pocket knife and a rifle was beginning to close. A new force was rising in the national consciousness, the consumer safety movement. Magazines and newspapers began running articles not about the joys of marksmanship, but about the dangers of projectiles. The eye injury statistics were being published. The safety mom demographic was becoming a political force. At the same time, the economic reality of manufacturing in the Rust Belt was turning grim. The unions in Michigan were strong, demanding higher wages and better benefits for the men who stamped the steel. The machinery in the Plymouth plant was aging, some of it dating back to the windmill days. To the accountants looking at the ledger, the factory was no longer a cathedral of industry. It was a liability. The decision was made in a series of closed-door meetings that would seal the fate of the town. Cass Hofe, now in charge, was a man torn between heritage and survival. He looked at the numbers, and he looked at the map. He saw a small town in the Ozark Mountains called Rogers, Arkansas. It was far away from the union bosses of Detroit. The labor was cheap. The land was plentiful. In 1958, the announcement dropped like a bomb. Daisy was leaving Plymouth. The betrayal felt physical. This was not just a business relocating. It was a family walking out on its grandfather. The workers in Plymouth were men who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of the air gun. They knew exactly how to heat the spring steel so it wouldn't snap in the cold. They knew how to turn the maple stocks so the grain resisted cracking. They possessed a tribal knowledge that couldn't be written down in a manual. When the trucks arrived to strip the factory, it was a funeral procession. The heavy stamping presses were unbolted from the concrete floors where they had sat since the 19th century. The tooling, the dies, the molds, everything was crated up. But the men were left behind. The master machinists, the woodworkers, the assemblers, they were given a handshake and a severance check and told to find new work in a town that had just lost its primary employer. The operation that set up shop in Rogers, Arkansas was modern, efficient, and utterly soulless compared to the brick fortress in Michigan. The new factory was designed for volume, for speed, and for cost reduction. And it was here in this sterile new environment that the lawyers and the accountants began to take control. Chapter 6. The Plastic Betrayal. As the 1970s arrived, the pressure from the Consumer Product Safety Commission became intense. The government was cracking down on everything. Lawn darts were banned, chemistry sets were gutted, and the BB gun was squarely in the crosshairs. The mandate was clear: make it safer, make it weaker, make it impossible to sue us. The engineers, once tasked with making the gun shoot harder and straighter, were now tasked with neutering them. The velocity was dialed back, the springs were weakened, the trigger mechanisms were redesigned to be idiot-proof, which also made them mushy and unsatisfying to pull. But the greatest crime was committed against the materials themselves. In the pursuit of profit and safety, the decision was made to abandon the wood. For decades, the soul of the Red Ryder had been the stock. It was a solid piece of American hardwood. It had heft, it had warmth. When a boy held it against his cheek, he felt a connection to the pioneers, to the cowboys, to the soldiers he idolized. Wood scratches, but it doesn't crack. Wood ages, but it doesn't shatter. Wood is real. The new management, obsessed with the bottom line and terrified of splinters or heavy objects, introduced the plastic stock. They called it durable composite. They molded it with a fake grain pattern to trick the eye. They painted it a muddy brown. But the moment you touched it, you knew you were being lied to. It was hollow. If you tapped it with your fingernail, it didn't make a solid thud. It made a cheap, high-pitched clack. It was slippery with the residue of the injection mold. It had a seam running down the center where the two halves of the plastic shell were glued together, a visible scar of mass production that no amount of marketing could hide. This was the plastic stock betrayal. It changed the fundamental relationship between the child and the object. A wooden rifle is a weapon. A plastic rifle is a toy. A wooden rifle demands care. You have to oil it, polish it, keep it dry. A plastic rifle is disposable. If you break it, you don't fix it. You throw it in the trash and buy another one. The degradation didn't stop at the stock. The heavy gauge steel of the barrel and receiver was thinned out. The metal lever, which used to be a solid curve of iron, became a flimsy piece of stamped sheet metal that wobbled when you cocked it. The saddle ring, once a functional piece of hardware, became a cosmetic decoration. By the mid-1970s, the Daisy Red Ryder had become a ghost of its former self. It looked like the gun from the comic books, but it felt like a prop. The danger had been engineered out, and with it, the respect. A child in 1940 knew that if he misused his Daisy, he could break a window or hurt a friend. The gun demanded respect because it was capable of violence. The new plastic version felt incapable of anything other than mild annoyance. The factory in Rogers churned these units out by the millions, and they sold. They sold because the parents of the 70s wanted to give their kids the experience they had had in the 50s. But they were buying a lie. They were handing their children a hollow simulacrum. The Daisy Boy of the marketing posters, the rugged kid learning to shoot straight, was replaced by a consumer simply unboxing a unit of plastic. The lawyers had won. They had successfully mitigated the liability. They had reduced the risk of lawsuits. They had cut the manufacturing costs in half. But in doing so, they had severed the artery of the brand. They had turned a rite of passage into a SKU number. The smell of gun oil and sawdust that had defined the Plymouth factory was gone. The air in the Arkansas plant smelled of heated polystyrene and cardboard. The tragedy of this era was that it wasn't a sudden death. It was a slow, agonizing slide into mediocrity. The executives patting themselves on the back for the quarterly profits didn't realize they were spending the accumulated social capital of the previous century. They were strip mining the nostalgia of the American father, selling him a product that looked like his childhood but felt like his disappointment. The betrayal wasn't that the gun stopped working, it was that the gun stopped mattering. It became just another piece of junk in the toy chest, buried under the action figures and the board games. No longer a sacred object to be hung on the wall, but a piece of plastic to be forgotten. Chapter 7. The Ghost Factory. The Plymouth factory did not die quickly. It rotted. For decades after the last truck left for Arkansas, the massive brick complex on Union Street stood as a silent, hulking tombstone in the center of the town. It was a physical manifestation of the industrial abandonment that was sweeping across the American Midwest. The windows, once bright with the blue light of arc welders and the yellow glow of incandescent bulbs, were shattered, jagged teeth of glass. The roof, which had sheltered the birth of the Red Ryder, began to sag under the weight of Michigan winters, leaking water onto the floors where the master machinists had once stood. To the locals, the building became a haunted place. It wasn't haunted by spirits in white sheets, but by the heavier, more oppressive ghosts of a lost way of life. If you walked past the chain-link fence on a quiet Tuesday, you could almost hear the phantom rhythm of the drop forges. You could smell the phantom scent of ozone and curing wood. It stood there for years, a blackened skeleton, reminding the town every single day that the era of Plymouth iron was over. When the demolition crews finally arrived to tear it down, they weren't just removing a safety hazard. They were burying a corpse that had been left out in the rain for half a century. Chapter 8. The Pixel Era. But the physical destruction of the factory was only the backdrop for a much more profound cultural extinction. The true death of the Daisy Empire didn't happen in a boardroom or a courtroom. It happened in the living room. As the 1980s bled into the 90s, a new kind of technology began to colonize the American childhood. It arrived in gray plastic boxes plugged into television sets. The Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega Genesis, and later the PlayStation. These machines offered a seductive alternative to the backyard. Why go outside where it was cold, where you had to set up tin cans, where you had to reload every single time, when you could sit on a carpet and fire a digital weapon at a digital enemy with the twitch of a thumb? The shift was catastrophic for the very concept of the air gun. The duck hunt gun, the Zapper, was the bridge. It was a plastic pistol, neon orange and gray, that fired a beam of light at a glass screen. There was no recoil. There was no projectile. There was no danger. You couldn't break a window with a Zapper. You couldn't sting your leg. It was the ultimate safe weapon, a sterilized simulation of marksmanship. This marked the beginning of the Pixel Era. The boy who used to be a Daisy boy, learning the discipline of breathing and trigger control to hit a penny at 30 feet, transformed into a gamer. The first-person shooter genre, games like Doom, GoldenEye, and later Call of Duty, replaced the physical act of shooting with a virtual one. The difference is not just semantic, it is spiritual. When a child fires a Red Ryder, they are interacting with physics. They are learning about gravity, windage, and the tangible properties of the material world. If they miss, the BB hits the fence with a thud. If they hit the can, it dances. It is real. It requires patience. It requires the child to exist in the environment. When a child plays a shooter game, they are interacting with an algorithm. The gun is a hitbox. The enemy is a polygon. The violence is hyper-realistic in its graphics, but utterly hollow in its consequence. They can fire 10,000 rounds in an hour without ever touching a piece of metal or smelling gun oil. The loop of load, aim, fire was replaced by the loop of respawn, spray, pray. The Daisy brand, trapped in Rogers, Arkansas, tried to compete. They tried to make guns that looked like the military weapons in the video games. They made tactical plastic rifles with rails and scopes. But it was a losing battle. They were trying to sell a tool to a generation that only wanted toys. The cultural cache of the BB gun evaporated. It went from being a rite of passage, the first step toward adulthood, to being a quaint, slightly embarrassing relic of a simpler time. Chapter 9. What remains today? If you walk into a big box store, you can still find a Red Ryder. It hangs in a plastic blister pack sandwiched between the fishing lures and the camping chairs. It is owned now by a faceless conglomerate, just another asset in a portfolio of outdoor brands. The box still features the cowboy, but the image is flat, divorced from the comic strips and the radio serials that gave it life. If you take that modern gun out of the box, the tragedy becomes tactile. It is light, terrifyingly light. The wood is the same hollow plastic that betrayed the legacy in the 70s. The metal is thin, coated in a black finish that scratches easily. The lever feels gritty. It is a product that has been value engineered to the absolute limit of functionality. It is designed to be bought, used for a single summer afternoon, and then forgotten in a garage until a garage sale 20 years later. The Plymouth Iron Windmill Company did not set out to build a toy. They set out to build a machine. And because they were iron men, they accidentally built a teacher. The original Red Ryder was a teacher of consequences. It taught a boy that he was dangerous. It taught him that he held power in his hands and that power required restraint. It was a heavy responsibility, literally and metaphorically. When we allowed the lawyers and the accountants to strip the weight out of the gun, and when we allowed the screens to strip the reality out of the shooting, we lost that teacher. We created a safe plastic world where nothing has any weight, where triggers have no resistance, and where mistakes can be reset with the press of a button. The ghosts of the Plymouth factory are not restless because their building was destroyed. They are restless because their philosophy was abandoned. They believed that a child was capable of handling the truth of steel. We decided they were only capable of handling the lie of plastic. The wind still blows through the empty lot where the factory once stood, kicking up dust in the space where the blast furnaces used to roar. But the air is silent now. The sharp, distinctive thwack of a copper ball hitting a tin can, the sound of an American childhood, has faded away, replaced by the silent, glowing hum of a billion screens playing a game where no one ever really learns to aim.